Why would three experienced engineers destroy their own nuclear reactor on purpose? What did the Soviet government hide in the secret archives that was more lethal than the radiation itself? Axiom has analyzed the forbidden data, and the answer will change everything you know about Chernobyl. They say that Anatoly Dyatlov, Alexander Akimov, and Leonid Toptunov, the men in command of Reactor 4, decided to play with fire. They say they pushed the wrong buttons, violated every safety rule imaginable, and that at 1:23 in the morning, they turned an energy titan into a nuclear volcano that spewed death upon the world. This narrative was recorded in official reports, dramatized in movies, and described in hundreds of books. It is a convenient lie. It gives us a face to blame. It allows the system, the bureaucracy, and the technology itself to escape unscathed. It allows everyone to close the case and sleep in peace, knowing that the fault lay with a few men, and not with a soulless machine. But Axiom's analysis reveals that this comfortable story is the greatest and most cynical forgery built upon the ruins of Reactor 4. The real record of that night does not speak of the failure of three men. It speaks of the programmed failure of an entire system, a failure carefully hidden and rewritten by the winners. Our investigation does not begin with assumptions. It begins with cold, impartial data. The artificial intelligence, Axiom, processed tens of thousands of pages, formerly secret files, interrogation protocols, reactor technical manuals, phone recordings, and even the personal diaries of those involved. The intelligence separated propaganda from fact, looking for the hidden connections that human eyes missed. The first conclusion is very clear. The official version of events is not just incomplete, it is a deliberate fabrication. In the official accusation, it is stated that the team conducted a dangerous experiment at an unacceptably low power level. It claims they turned off vital safety systems and by their own actions cornered the reactor into an uncontrollable state. That was not quite how it happened. Axiom asked the simplest question: why? Why would experienced engineers, men who dedicated their entire lives to atomic energy, suddenly turn into madmen, playing Russian roulette with a nuclear core? The official explanation blames psychology. They speak of Dyatlov's arrogance, of his relentless pressure on his subordinates. It is an explanation that seems to make sense emotionally, but one that crumbles under logical analysis. We analyzed the profiles of every operator in that room. Alexander Akimov, the shift chief, 33 years old, was known as a methodical and extremely responsible engineer. Leonid Toptunov, the senior reactor control engineer, was only 26 years old. He was young, yes, and had been in the post for only 2 months, but he was considered exceptionally capable. And there was Anatoly Dyatlov, the deputy chief engineer, a man with colossal experience, but also with a reputation for being a tough and demanding supervisor. The official story paints Dyatlov as the great villain, a man who forced his younger colleagues to take a deadly risk, perhaps under threat of dismissal. But the analysis of the transcripts and survivor testimonies conducted by Axiom reveals a very different picture. The pressure existed, it was real, but it did not come only from Dyatlov, it came from much, much higher up. The test of turbo generator number 8, which they were conducting, should have happened hours earlier during the day on April 25th. The day shift was prepared and rested, but a phone call changed their fate. A dispatcher from the Kyiv power grid called and ordered that the reactor shutdown be postponed. The grid needed the energy. This decision, made by someone in a distant office, forced the reactor to operate for almost 10 hours at half power. This plunged it into an unstable state known as xenon poisoning. The reactor was sick, intoxicated, long before the night crew took over. That was not Dyatlov's decision. It was an external order that placed the team in an impossible situation. The system demanded electricity. The system demanded that the plan be fulfilled, and the system ignored safety protocols long before Akimov or Toptunov touched any button. The accusation focused on the violation of the manual. They say the team committed the cardinal sin of lowering the operational reactivity margin below the critical level. Basically, they supposedly removed so many control rods from the core that the reactor was left without brakes. The official version says they did this knowingly in a gross violation of the rules, but we fed Axiom the exact operations manual that was on the control desk that night. The intelligence found a devastating detail. In the 1986 version of the regulations, there was not a single word, not a line that said, operating the reactor with a reactivity margin of fewer than 15 rods was categorically prohibited. This vital item, this safety rule that seems so obvious today, was only added to the manuals after the catastrophe. The operators did not violate a rule that, for them, simply did not exist. They were acting within the limits of the knowledge that the reactor's creators themselves provided them. They were walking through a minefield, convinced the ground was safe, because the map they held in their hands was blank. The operators were walking in a minefield that was not on the map. The question Axiom asked next was inevitable. Who hid the mines? The intelligence's correlation analysis began to build a clear line of responsibility. This line did not stop in the control room, nor in the plant director's office. It went out of Chernobyl and straight to Moscow, to the offices of the designers of the RBMK reactor themselves, the revered Kurchatov Institute. They knew of the fatal defect hidden in the heart of the machine. The trap was in the RBMK reactor itself. The first step is to understand what it was. It was the pride of Soviet atomic engineering. A giant 7 stories high, made of nearly 2,000 tons of graphite blocks, pierced by more than 1,600 fuel channels. It was considered powerful, reliable, and, most important of all, economical. But Axiom, upon analyzing the blueprints, discovered that this economy was achieved at the cost of safety. The RBMK was a hybrid reactor. It did not serve only to generate electricity. Its design allowed for the production of plutonium for nuclear weapons and allowed this to be done without ever shutting down the reactor. This dual purpose, civil and military, gave rise to a series of engineering decisions that would be unthinkable in any other reactor in the world. One of these decisions was the design of the control rods. In any reactor, the control rods are the brakes. They are made of materials, like boron, that absorb neutrons and stop the chain reaction. In the RBMK reactor, there were 211 of these rods. The AZ5 button, the emergency protection, was the mechanism that was supposed to insert all these 211 rods into the core at once. It was the handbrake, the last resort. It was the absolute guarantee that no matter what happened, the reactor could be shut down in seconds. This was what Akimov and Toptonov believed that night, but they did not know about the demon hiding in the details of this design. We created in Axiom an exact 3-dimensional simulation of the core of Reactor 4. We recreated the neutron fields and the water flow second by second, exactly as they were at 1:23 in the morning. And then, in the simulation, we pressed the AZ5 button. What the intelligence showed goes against common sense. In the first 4 or 5 seconds after the stop button was triggered, the total power in the lower part of the reactor did not drop. It increased hundreds of times. The explanation for this lay in the design of the rod. The channel through which the rod descends was 7 meters high. The boron rod, which absorbs neutrons, was about 5 meters long. But below it, there was another piece, known as the graphite displacer. When a rod was fully raised out of the core, the situation was that the upper part of the channel had the graphite displacer, and the lower part of the channel was filled with a pillar of water. Water, like boron, also absorbs neutrons and helps break the reaction. Graphite, on the contrary, accelerates the reaction. Returning to the control room, to try to keep the reactor alive, the operators had raised almost all the rods to the highest position. The bottom of the reactor was full of these pillars of water, which acted as a partial brake. At 1:23 and 40 seconds, Akimov gave the order, and Toptunov pressed AZ5. The 211 rods begin to descend. And the trap springs. Boron was the material that should have braked the reaction, but it was not the first to enter. The first thing that touched the bottom of the reactor was the graphite, a material that, in those conditions, acted as an accelerator. And this accelerator began to push the water out of the channels. The problem is that the water was also there serving as a brake. For a few fatal seconds, the system removed a brake and replaced it with an accelerator. In the hottest and most unstable part of the core, this caused an unimaginable power spike. The operators trying to stop the reactor actually slammed their foot on the accelerator with all their might. This is the tip effect, Axiom confirms. Under the conditions the reactor was in, pressing the AZ5 button guaranteed an explosion with 99.9% probability. They had no chance. The most terrible question of all is, did no one know this? The intelligence did a deep search in the secret archives and found the traces. In 1975, at the Leningrad nuclear power plant, an identical reactor had already caused problems. During routine operations, a similar incident happens. A sudden power spike when the rods are moved, a fuel channel ruptures. The experts from the Kurchatov Institute, the very same designers, investigated. They saw the tip effect in action. They calculated the consequences. They realized they had created a machine with a built-in catastrophic failure mechanism. And what did they do? They wrote a secret report that was shelved. Instead of stopping all the RBMK reactors in the country and starting an expensive and politically shameful modernization, they decided to hide the information. They sent vague bulletins to the plants, mentioning caution when moving the rods, but they never explained the real physics of the problem. They told the operators to be careful on the road, but they never told them that the road was mined. The cost of admitting the truth was too high. Admitting the flaw would mean the collapse of the entire program, an international scandal, and a blow to the prestige of Soviet science. The price of truth was considered too high. 11 years later in Pripyat, others paid the bill. The fact is, Reactor 4 was a trap. The AZ5 button, the supposed safety measure, was the detonator. But a trap, however deadly, needs someone to disarm it. The question Axiom asked next was, why were the operators even near this trigger? What was happening that night that led Akimov and Toptunov to press that button? The official story offers us a noble explanation, saying it was a safety test. The goal of the experiment was to find out if, in the event of a total plant blackout, a turbine spinning by inertia could generate enough electricity to power the water pumps for 60 critical seconds. 60 seconds until the emergency diesel generators turned on. It was a test designed to increase the safety of the plant. But when Axiom analyzed the paperwork behind this test, the nobility vanished, revealing dismissive bureaucracy and relentless pressure. First, the test program was not written by the reactor designers, the Kurchatov Institute. It was drafted by an external organization, Dontishenergo. They were electrical engineers, not nuclear physicists. They wrote an excellent plan on what to do with the turbine and the generator, but the plan barely mentioned what to do with the pulsing heart of the plant, which was the nuclear reactor. Second, Axiom discovered that this plan did not have the necessary approval signatures. Neither the chief designer of the reactor nor the scientific supervisor of the RBMK had signed the document. Legally, that test should never have happened. So, why the rush? Why did the plant management, Viktor Bryukhanov and his chief engineer Fomin, give the green light to such an irregular procedure? The answer lay in the calendar. The deadline to hand over Block 4 as fully operational to the State Commission was approaching. The test needed to be completed at any cost before the May 1st holiday. The urgency came not from safety, but from bonuses, medals, and reports sent to Moscow. It was at this point that the first domino began to fall, the one that started falling almost a day before the explosion. The test should have started on the afternoon of April 25th. A rested team, led by the experienced engineer Vladimir Chugunov, prepared the reactor. They began to reduce power, following the plan. Then the phone rang. The dispatcher from the Kiev power grid. The grid needed energy. The test was interrupted in the middle. This decision, made by a bureaucrat miles away, condemned Reactor 4. Axiom simulated what happened in the following 9 hours. Forced to operate at half power, the reactor began to suffocate. Inside the core of an RBMK reactor, there is a phenomenon called xenon poisoning, or the iodine pit. When power drops, the reactor begins to accumulate xenon-135. This gas is like poison to the chain reaction. It absorbs neutrons and puts out the nuclear fire. To compensate for this poison, operators are forced to do one thing: pull more and more control rods out of the core just to keep the power stable. When night came and the new team took over, they did not receive control of a healthy reactor. Akimov and Topchanov inherited a sick, unstable machine already poisoned. They received the order, continue the test, and then the second domino fell. Shortly after midnight, while trying to transfer control from one automatic system to another, Leonid Toptunov, the young operator, made a mistake. He couldn't hold the power. The reactor, already choking on xenon, died. The power plummeted to almost zero. This was the end point. Any manual, any physicist, any rule of common sense said that at that moment the reactor should be shut down immediately. That should have been the end of the story, with a 24-hour wait for the xenon to decay. But in the control room was Anatoly Dyatlov. Behind Dyatlov, invisible, were Bryukhanov and Fomin, and behind them was the shadow of the May 1st deadline, the shadow of the system that did not accept failure. Dyatlov did not accept the shutdown. He gave the order that sealed everyone's fate. Raise the power. They began to do the impossible. To resurrect the dead reactor, they had to pull the remaining control rods, one by one. They were removing the last brakes from a machine they didn't know had a defective accelerator. They were fighting against the xenon poison, blind to the trap of the tip effect that awaited them. They succeeded. In that control room, fighting the xenon-poisoned reactor, Dyatlov, Akimov and Topchanov managed to force the machine. They raised the power back to the level required by the test, 200 megawatts. The reactor was stable, but it was the stability of a bomb with the pin pulled. They were blind to the trap they had set. The control rods, the brakes, were almost all out of the core. The AZ-5 button, the supposed savior, was now positioned to inject graphite, the accelerator, into the hottest part of the reactor. 1:23 and 4 seconds in the morning. The experiment begins. The steam feed to turbine number 8 is closed. It starts to spin by inertia. But without the steam flow, the water in the core starts to heat up too fast. The power starts to rise. 1:23 and 40 seconds. Akimov, seeing the rise, does exactly what the manual ordered. He orders the total shutdown. Engage AZ-5. Leonid Topchanov presses the button. That red button, the final guarantee of safety. The trap springs. 211 rods begin to descend. But, as Axiom's simulation proved, in the first few seconds, the core did not receive the break it should have. Instead, it received the graphite tips. An unimaginable power spike tears through the bottom of the reactor. The operators heard a deep rumble while the gauges shot to infinity before dying. The rods jam halfway down. The heat is so intense that the channels deform. 3 seconds later came the second rumble, a gigantic blast that seals the fate of the world. The reactor's cover plate, a 2,000-ton steel and concrete lid called Elena, is thrown into the air as if it were cardboard. The core is open. Atmospheric air comes into contact with 1,700 tons of superheated graphite. Hell begins. But at that moment, time split in two. In the physical world, the apocalypse had arrived. In the reality of the Soviet bureaucracy, a different chain reaction was just beginning. A reaction of denial, fear, and lies. Viktor Bryukhanov, the plant director, was asleep in his apartment in Pripyat. He was woken by the phone at 1:30 in the morning. When he arrived at the command bunker, he saw the destruction. He saw the walls of the reactor building crumbled. But his mind, trained by the system, refused to process the impossible. After all, RBMK reactors do not explode. The plant's dosimeters, the devices that measure radiation, were useless. The low-scale ones burned out instantly. The high-scale ones were locked in a safe, and no one could find the key. The men sent to assess the reactor did not return. At 2:15 in the morning, Bryukhanov picked up the phone to call Moscow. Axiom analyzed the transcript of this call. It is the exact moment when the tragedy turns into a crime. Pressured by his superiors, Bryukhanov says the phrase that would paralyze the emergency response for 36 hours. He says, "There was an accident and a fire. The reactor is most likely intact. The reactor is intact." This lie, born of panic and the fear of a system that punished bad news, became the official truth. Moscow, believing it was dealing with a fire, acted accordingly. But Axiom mapped what that lie really cost. That night, the wind was blowing to the west. It carried an invisible plume of deadly particles directly to the city of Pripyat, less than 3 kilometers away. 50,000 people slept, but no one woke them or told them to close the windows. When Saturday morning arrived, the sun was shining. Children went out to play in the streets, going to school, riding bicycles. They played in the dust, unaware that every particle contained more radiation than they should receive in a lifetime. And the local authorities, even already knowing of the dangerous radiation levels, received orders from Moscow. Do not cause panic. The situation is under control. The reactor is intact. It was 36 hours. 36 hours in which the city breathed death, while the government lied to itself. Evacuation only began the next day, April 27th. The lie was so complete that it was not undone from within. It was exposed by the outside world. On Monday morning, April 28th, more than 1,000 kilometers away in Sweden, radiation alarms at the Forsmark nuclear power plant went off. The Swedish technicians were confused. They looked for a leak in their own plant and found nothing. They analyzed the dust on the employees' shoes. The isotope composition was strange. The signature was unmistakable and did not belong to their plants. It was the unmistakable signature of an RBMK reactor. The wind had brought the truth that Bryukhanov tried to hide. The world did not discover the disaster through a confession, but because it was forced to follow the trail of the cloud. The official story insists on a single explosion. A powerful event, yes, but understandable. A steam explosion. An industrial accident, tragic and severe, but still, an accident. This version is clean. It is manageable. But this version is a lie. What happened at 1:23 in the morning involved 2 distinct explosions, separated by a few seconds. Axiom began by analyzing the testimonies of eyewitnesses, those who survived the first moments. Valery Perevoschenko, a senior operator, was directly above the reactor hall. He reported hearing 2 deep rumbles, one right after the other. Alexander Yevchenko, a mechanical engineer who was in the corridor between Block 3 and 4, felt the same thing. First, a dull thud, as if a giant hammer had hit the building. The floor and walls shook. Seconds later, a second explosion, deafening, which blew out the lights and caused the plaster to collapse. But the clearest evidence came from outside the plant. Fishermen on the Pripyat River, sitting in the dark, saw the sky light up. They described 2 lights. They first saw a dark red flash that rose over Block 4, and almost instantly, a second light, much brighter. A bluish column that shot straight into the sky. 2 knocks, 2 different colors. Human memory can be deceptive. That is why Axiom looked for a witness that cannot lie, the Earth itself. The seismographs installed in the Chernobyl region recorded the tremors of that night. The result of the analysis is crystal clear. The tape does not show a single seismic event. It shows 2. The first at 1:23 and 40 seconds. The second, much more powerful, about 3 to 4 seconds later. Axiom then reconstructed what happened in those fatal seconds. The first explosion was, in fact, caused by steam. It was the direct result of that design flaw, the tip effect. When the graphite tips of the AZ5 button entered the core, the power skyrocketed. The water in the channels boiled instantly. The steam pressure tore hundreds of fuel channels apart. It was this force that threw the 2,000-ton Elena lid. The reactor was open. It breathed. And that breath was fatal. It is at this point that the official story deceives us again. They claim the second explosion was caused by hydrogen. The theory is that the hot steam reacted with the zirconium in the fuel, created hydrogen gas, which then mixed with oxygen in the air and exploded. It sounds scientific, but Axiom analyzed the chemistry. In 3 seconds, it is physically impossible to generate and mix enough hydrogen to cause the massive explosion that was recorded. Furthermore, hydrogen burns with an orange-yellow flame. The witnesses saw a bright blue light. What Axiom discovered is much more frightening. When the first explosion blew the lid off and destroyed the channels, all the cooling water disappeared. The control rods, the brakes, were jammed. For a fraction of a second, the heart of the RBMK reactor was left with nothing to stop it. The molten fuel collapsed onto itself. The reactor, for an instant, formed a new configuration. A supercritical mass, What happened next was a fast neutron excursion. It was an uncontrolled chain reaction. Although it was not a classic atomic bomb, it was a nuclear event of the same nature. The energy released was equivalent to 10, perhaps 20 tons of explosives. It was this second explosion, the nuclear explosion, that caused the real destruction. That blue flash had a specific name in physics. It is the unmistakable light that particles emit when they travel faster than the speed of light inside a medium, such as ionized air. It is the visual signature of an active nuclear reaction. The final proof was found months later in the flooded basements of the reactor. The famous elephant's foot, a black mass of lava composed of molten fuel, sand, and concrete. Axiom analyzed its composition. To create that lava, temperatures of over 2,000 degrees Celsius were necessary. Neither a steam explosion nor a hydrogen explosion could do that, only an uncontrolled nuclear reaction. The lie of the single explosion was told to hide a terrifying truth. The Soviet system did not just create a civil reactor, it created a machine that, under the wrong conditions, could turn into an improvised bomb. The lie about the single steam explosion was created to hide the truth about the machine. But Axiom discovered a second lie, much darker, created to hide the truth about the victims. They went down in history as heroes. The 28 firefighters, the first to arrive, and the hundreds of plant workers who, in those initial hours, tried to tame the reactor. They walked over the destroyed roof, kicking pieces of radioactive graphite without even knowing what they were doing. We were told the story of their sacrifice, of their agonizing death by acute radiation sickness. While this is true, it is only the polished surface of the story. The real story of what happened to their bodies was locked away along with their medical records. They were buried in zinc coffins, sealed under concrete slabs, not just because they were radioactive. They were buried because their own bodies became the final proof of what really happened that night. Axiom had access to these files, which included doctors' diaries, notes from nurses at Clinical Hospital No. 6 in Moscow, photos, and autopsy reports. When the intelligence compared these symptoms with all known radiological accidents from Hiroshima onwards, it pointed to very strange problems. The doctors in Moscow, the best in the country, were dealing with something they had never seen. The first anomaly became known as the nuclear tan. The skin of the firefighters, especially on their faces and hands, did not have the redness of a normal burn. It acquired a dark brown tone, almost tanned, as if it were cured leather. Axiom simulated the cause. Gamma radiation alone could not cause that. That tan was the result of a beta particle storm, billions of particles bombarding and cooking the upper layers of the skin. This could only happen if they were walking, literally, on fragments of pure nuclear fuel. The second anomaly was in their lungs. Many had severe internal burns. The official version blamed hot steam and smoke, but that did not explain the total destruction of the tissue. Axiom connected this to the second explosion, the nuclear explosion. That explosion generated a plasma flash of thousands of degrees. The men on the front line were not breathing ordinary smoke. What they inhaled in that second was plasma. Their lungs were burned from the inside by a heat that only exists in a nuclear event. But the strangest symptom, the one that for so long was treated as a rumor, was what Axiom confirmed through the ward records. Lieutenant Vladimir Pravik, a young man of 23, had brown eyes. In his last days at the hospital in Moscow, his eyes turned blue. How is this possible? The intelligence analyzed the physics of an uncontrolled nuclear excursion. Such an event releases not only gamma and beta radiation, it releases a colossal pulse of neutrons. Axiom hypothesized that Pravik was hit by a neutron flux so intense that it physically altered the melanin pigment in his iris, changing its color. They were not exposed to radiation from an accident. They were hit by the same effects as a nuclear weapon. Their burial itself raises questions. Why zinc? Why concrete? The official lie said it was to contain the gamma radiation their bodies emitted. But Axiom's analysis shows that this was not the main concern. The real danger was what they had inside them. By breathing that air, they inhaled microscopic particles of fuel. Their bodies were full of uranium, plutonium, and other heavy elements. Their organisms became literally long-term atomic waste deposits. If they were buried in normal coffins, these deadly elements would eventually leak into the soil and water. They were sealed in zinc and concrete, not as heroes, but following the same protocol used to bury nuclear waste. The system was not just protecting the population from their remains, it was hiding the proof. It was burying the undeniable evidence that the reactor not only melted, it exploded like a bomb, scattering its nuclear fuel everywhere. The bodies of those men were the final crime scene. The bodies of the firefighters, sealed in zinc, were the human proof of what happened. But the reactor left a second proof, an indelible signature, not on the ground, but in the sky. When the core exploded, it released a radioactive cloud that traveled the world. Governments lied, but the cloud could not. It was a posthumous letter from the reactor, written in the language of physics. Axiom analyzed the data from that cloud, collected by laboratories across Europe. The key was in the ratio of rare gases, specifically in the xenon signature. The explanation is simple. In a reactor operating normally, the ratio of different types of xenon is stable and predictable. If a reactor simply melts, this ratio changes in a certain way. But the samples collected in Sweden and Germany showed neither a normal reactor nor a melted reactor. They showed a ratio of new xenon that could only have been created in one way. A colossal pulse of energy, thousands of times stronger than normal, moments before the explosion. The cloud was forensic proof. It confirmed the nuclear explosion. And the scientists knew it. The Soviets knew. The Americans, the British, the French. Everyone who analyzed the cloud saw that the math did not match the official story. In Vienna, in August 1986, the world was demanding answers. The Soviet delegation, led by Valery Legasov, took the podium. Legasov told a half-truth. He shocked the world by admitting the design flaw. He spoke about the AZ-5 button. He admitted the tip effect. But he placed the ultimate blame on the operators, who supposedly drove the machine to an extreme no one could predict. He never mentioned the nuclear explosion. He never mentioned that the designers had known about the flaw for years. And the West, instead of confronting him with the xenon cloud data, applauded him. Hans Blix, the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, thanked the Soviets for their openness. Why? Why the silence? Axiom analyzed the global context and discovered a conspiracy not of malice but of mutual fear. The world was terrified, less by Chernobyl and more by the idea that any reactor could do that. The United States had just gone through its own nightmare at 3 Mile Island. The British had their own secret accidents at Windscale. If the International Atomic Energy Agency admitted that a civil reactor could, under the wrong conditions, detonate like a nuclear bomb, it would be the end of the global nuclear industry. Hundreds of billions of dollars would be at risk. So they made a silent agreement. The world would accept the Soviet lie of operator error. This made Chernobyl a Soviet problem, a failure of an unstable RBMK reactor and a flawed culture, isolating the case as if it were not a nuclear problem. It was Operation Silence. This even explains the global cover-up, but the madness of that night still needs to be understood. It does not explain why Dyatlov was under such pressure to conduct an irregular test in a poisoned reactor in the middle of the night. Axiom dug deeper, beyond the international agency reports, into the secret military archives, and found the real reason: the plutonium protocol. We already knew that the RBMK reactor was a hybrid, made to produce military-grade plutonium. In the mid-80s, the Cold War was at its peak. The Soviets desperately needed an answer to Reagan's Star Wars program. They were working on something called the photon program. The idea was to use the energy from nuclear reactors to power X-ray lasers in space. But to do this, they needed to understand how their reactors behaved in extreme regimes, in short pulses of immense energy. The safety test at Chernobyl was a cover. The true mission of that night, known only to a few at the top, was part of the photon program. They were using Reactor 4 to collect military data. Anatoly Dyatlov, pressuring his men to raise the power of a dead reactor, was not just trying to save his job. He was, unknowingly, fulfilling the parameters of a secret military experiment. He was pushing the reactor to exactly the limit the military wanted to study. Akimov and Topchanov discovered that their role went beyond simple operators. They were being used as guinea pigs. And the explosion. It was the final and tragic irony. When Akimov pressed AZ5, he didn't just activate the design flaw. He unwittingly gave the reactor the exact pulse of energy that the photon program military were trying to study. He accidentally initiated the experiment they came to observe. The system hid the truth not just because it was a technological disaster. It hid it because it was a failed military experiment of monstrous proportions. The story of Chernobyl is not a story of arrogance or incompetence. It is the story of a weapon that backfired. In the end, the word accident does not describe what happened. The correct word is murder. If you like this investigation, subscribing to the channel helps us expand the Axiom investigation project. We would love to read your thoughts on the video's subject in the comments and your suggestion for the next topic to be covered. Tell us which city you are watching from. Thank you for staying with us until the end.